Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a full room for such an important event. My name is Andrew Guzman. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the 10th Annual Sachs Institute Fall Distinguished Lecture. Before I get into my introduction any further, I need to issue an apology. I have to leave immediately after these introductory remarks. I have another commitment upstairs that started 15 minutes ago, so I will go to that. So I apologize for that. I wish I could stay. I also want to make a few acknowledgments. Some of the source of support for the Sachs Institute. I want to thank the Sidney R. Bear Jr. Foundation, the Doris Bree Trust, Battery Powered, Rich and Christine Getz, the Anthony and Jean Pritzker Family Foundation, and indeed all the supporters of the Sachs Institute who allow us, and when I say us, I mean Ellen, to do the incredible work that we, by which I mean she, does. But it's great to see so many people here for this event. So I know that today we have, at a minimum, mental health professionals, advocates, consumers. We have leaders from the academy, and I know we have lots of other people who are interested in the topic for all kinds of different reasons. So it's great to have such a diverse and varied audience here. The thing we try to achieve at USC Gould is we try to advance justice and its causes for the improvement of society. And we think we can do that, and we think we do that through legal education, through scholarship, through impact on practice and policy. The drivers of that are principally our faculty, obviously, who produce research that addresses critical legal issues across the spectrum of our society and engages in work that shapes the public discourse. I say all of that because Ellen Sachs and the Sachs Institute are the poster child of that kind of engagement. Since its establishment in 2010, the Sachs Institute has both studied, in an academic sense, critical topics at the intersection of law, mental health, and ethics. It has also worked in real time and on the ground to promote policy changes that improve the lives of people with mental illness. And so both in the most academic sense of academic and in a very applied policy sense, the Sachs Institute has been highly successful. We're so proud of the Institute. It is only through great force of will that I'm resisting the temptation to list its many achievements in the 9+ years it's been in existence. I want to preserve time for the program, which is obviously why we're here. I don't have enough fortitude to do the same with respect to Ellen, however. So you may have seen Ellen, aside from around the law school, on CNN. You may have heard her on NPR. You may have read about her in the New York Times, watched her TED Talk. Even if you know her from all those things, I'm going to say a few things about her. The official, by the book title, Ellen, Professor Sachs, is the Orrin B. Evans Professor of Law, Psychology, and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the Gould School of Law. She holds the title of Distinguished Professor of USC, which is a rare and prestigious appointment bestowed by the university president. She's one of our nation's leading authorities on law and mental health, having published 5 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters on the subject. She's the author of a New York Times bestseller, The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness, doubling the number of New York Times bestsellers at the front of the room. Her memoir is a really powerful book describing her struggles with schizophrenia. In 2009, Professor Sachs was named the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, better known as a Genius Grant. And she used that to start the Sachs Institute, which speaks loudly to who Ellen is and her priorities. She took a personal achievement, the Genius Grant, and turned it into an instrument of scholarship and service and policy change to help so many others. And so without any further delay, please welcome Ellen Sachs.
Thank you, Dean Guzman, Andrew, for those very, very kind words. I'm thrilled and delighted to be here today. I want to introduce our speaker. Her name is Esmé Weijun Wang, and she's a novelist and an essayist. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller called The Collected Schizophrenias, for which she won the Grey Wolf Nonfiction Prize. Her debut novel, The Border of Paradise, was called one of the best book of 2016 by NPR, and one of the 25 best novels of 2016 by Electric Literature. She was named by Granta as one of the, quote, best young American novelists in 2017 and won the Whiting Award in 2018. Born in the Midwest to Taiwanese parents She lives in San Francisco, and she can be found at esmewang.com and on Twitter at Esmé Wang. So honored and delighted to have you come up and talk. So Esme's going to speak for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to have a kind of Q&A between each other, with each other, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So thank you. She's amazing. I forgot to say.
I'm so excited to be with you all today. I'm honored to be brought here by USC and the Sachs Institute, which was such an inspiration to me as I was working on my book, The Collected Schizophrenias. But I have to say, a delight that I was not expecting was how happy I would be to be giving my talk while looking at a room of people just crushing some sandos while I was talking about stigma and mental illness and all that stuff. You guys just really going after it. And I really appreciate that about you. So today I'm going to be sharing some stories, and I'll talk about some big ideas. I'm going to tell some bad jokes, and hopefully open our minds to learning about one another's minds. I'm going to talk about stigma, different forms of stigma, and how toxic stigma can be, as well as how embedded it is in our culture and in other cultures. I'll discuss the fight against stigma and ways that encouraging self-advocacy and resilience can help to soften other difficulties that go with a mental health diagnosis. And finally, and this is a little bit difficult to imagine, but I'll talk about hopes and dreams and how the jobs of mental health professionals are to carry other people's hopes and dreams for them when they can't do it themselves. So before I start, I'd like to paint a picture of what it might look like to be a person living with a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, in this case, me, who sees themselves as identifying very much with their diagnosis. From an essay called "Yale Will Not Save You." I'm still trying to figure out what okay is, particularly whether there exists a normal version of myself beneath the disorder, in the way a person with cancer is a healthy person first and foremost. In the language of cancer, people describe a thing that invades them so that they can then battle the cancer. No one ever says that a person is cancer or that they have become cancer, but they do say that a person is manic depressive or schizophrenic once those illnesses have taken hold. In my peer education course, I was taught to say that I am a person with schizoaffective disorder. Person first language suggests that there is a person in there somewhere without the delusions and the rambling and the catatonia. But what if there isn't? What happens if I see my disordered mind as a fundamental part of who I am? It has, in fact, shaped the way I experience life. Should the question be a matter of percentages of my lifetime, I've spent enough of my lifetime with schizoaffective disorder to see it as a dominant force. And if it's true that I think, therefore I am, perhaps the fact that my thoughts have been so heavily modeled with confusion means that those confused thoughts make up the gestalt of myself. This is why I use the word schizophrenic, even though many advocates don't. My friends with anxiety disorders, for example, tend to speak of anxiety as a component of their personalities. Laura Turner writes in her essay, "How do you inherit anxiety?" It is from Verna Lee Boatwright-Berg that I inherited my long face, my quick hands, my fear that someday soon I will do something wrong and the world will come to a sharp end. In their minds, there's no tabula rasa overlaid by transparency of hypochondria, generalized anxiety disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. Such thoughts are hardwired into their minds, with no self that can be untangled from the pathology they experience. Another friend's obsessive-compulsive disorder has calmed significantly since she started taking Prozac, but she continues to be most comfortable when things are tidy, even though her tidiness is no longer disruptive to her life. She continues to wash her hands more than anyone I know. There might be something comforting about the notion that there is, deep down, an impeccable self without disorder, and that if I try hard enough, I can reach that unblemished self. But there may be no impeccable self to reach, and if I continue to struggle toward one, I might go mad in the pursuit. I share this because I want to start off with the idea that people like me, or maybe you, the people with the mental health issues, have all kinds of different ideas about how we might relate to our mental health issues. At different times in my life, I've identified more or identified less with my diagnosis, which impacts my life differently depending on how much stigma I'm facing in the moment. I've been living and working in the worlds of mental health and illness for a while now, and I've often been asked, so, what is it like to disclose to people that you've been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder? And to be honest, it used to be a lot harder before I published a book that is, in fact, about my life with a psychotic disorder. The information often comes before people meet me, instead of months into a friendship or years into working with me. I used to get hired at jobs and leave them without ever disclosing that I was experiencing delusions and hallucinations. And that time in my life was stressful. It was stressful because I didn't know when, if ever, would be the appropriate time to come out about having a serious mental health diagnosis. In my personal life, in my work life, in my school life. I remember meeting a classmate named Anna, and I really felt like we were going to become friends. And her then boyfriend and my now husband were going on a double date. I haven't even told you what movies we were going to see yet. They were going to go see Superman, and we were going to go see The Devil Wears Prada. Talk about the gender binary. Anyway, so Superman was starting about half an hour before The Devil Wears Prada, and so Anna and I went to the movie theater cafe for coffee. And I was really nervous. My diagnosis at the time was bipolar disorder, and I felt that we were at that early point in the friendship where I needed to tell her that I had that diagnosis. So I just blurted it out. I need to tell you something, I said, with exactly that amount of chill. I have bipolar disorder. Oh, okay, she said. Anna was and is a very kind person. We are still friends over 13 years later. I have an anxiety disorder, she said. And I was like, yeah, success. And later, I would learn so much more about what Anna was dealing with, including generalized anxiety disorder and hypochondria, and she would see me through inpatient hospitalization and the dawning of my psychotic symptoms. Anna is one of the people that has provided me with support rather than stigma. But this has not always been the case. We live in a society that frequently throws around words like psycho and schizo and crazy. That's one small thing we can do, to not say crazy when what we really mean is ridiculous. We can try to catch our verbal habits in order to prevent ourselves from reinforcing the fact that pop culture portrays mental illness as something to fear, rather than something that can happen to the people that we love, or even ourselves. Something from our worst nightmares, and certainly not something we can thrive with. And we can catch when other people do the same thing. It's hard to speak up when someone else is doing the talking, but it's worth it to the community at large if you can say, oh, do you mean that it's ridiculous, not crazy? I thank you in advance for doing this. Before the collected Schizophrenias came out, but while I was writing it, I would notice stigma about my diagnosis coming from absolutely well-meaning people. At a writer's residency, no one knew about my diagnosis until one morning when we were going around in a circle, reading our work aloud. And I read from an essay about the metaphor of possession and schizophrenia, which mentioned my inpatient hospitalizations. And after everyone finished reading, one of the other writers, who had always treated me completely normally, said, "It's so amazing that you're sick that way because you could never tell. You don't have those tics and things." At a fundraising party for my publisher, a donor came up to me and said, "It's so good to meet you. You're so eloquent for someone who has such a terrible diagnosis." And every time someone says something like this to me, I would have absolutely no idea what to say. I would have no idea, particularly if this person was to remain in my life, if they would go on to see me differently. It always felt like a roll of the dice. Because what was there to say in the face of this history of stigma, particularly about schizophrenia and its related disorders? On the other hand, spending time around me was one way to decrease stigma because prejudice often dies in proximity. I should be glad that no one thinks I'm a potential murderer, because that's one of the few times I hear about schizophrenia in the news, when someone commits a terrible act of violence and it turns out that they have schizophrenia. Stigma comes from American culture, Western culture, but it's also carried over from immigrant cultures. My parents came from Taiwan in the early 80s, and when my high school counselor finally told me that my depression and anxiety were serious enough that I finally needed to see a psychiatrist, I told my mother, and my mother yelled at me. "How could you do this?" she said. "How could you do this when we've always fed you and clothed you and provided a roof over your head?" I cried and cried. I went to school that morning and I skipped first period and I hid in the art room crying. And I didn't actually see a psychiatrist until that school counselor summoned my mother to the school and told her that if I didn't see a psychiatrist, I could hurt myself. And this, my mother understood. When my mother took me to see a psychiatrist, who was a white man, and who kept the shades pulled shut, he asked her if there was a history of mental illness in the family. Standard question. Did we, he asked, have any relatives who had any kind of mental illness? No, my mother said, and as far as I knew, that was the truth. Later, I would learn this was not true. My great aunt, my mother's aunt, had died in a mental institution. My mother's cousin had killed himself, and my mom had experienced depression and anxiety. But when I asked my mom why, she hadn't said anything to the psychiatrist. When he asked her, she said in Chinese, 我们不讲这种东西. In other words, it was none of his business, even if he was a psychiatrist. I learned, too, that she'd been diagnosed with panic disorder, among other things, but refused to take the medication she'd been prescribed. She'd been so depressed after giving birth to me that she nearly killed me and then herself. But it was none of his business. Cultural stigma is a big part of most cultural groups, which is one reason that mental health professionals who are members of an in-group can be so helpful. In the end, back when I was a teenager, I finally saw a Chinese-American psychiatrist long-term, and I am sure that having a psychiatrist who could communicate with my parents directly and in a way that they could truly understand was important to my entry into the mental health world. The website, Therapy for Black Girls, for example, has a directory of mental health professionals who provide services for Black women and girls. Similarly, the website Therapy for Latinx provides a directory for Latinx therapists all over the country. Before I came out publicly about my diagnosis of first bipolar disorder and then schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, I worked at the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Lab in the psychology department at Stanford, as well as the bipolar clinic in the psychiatry department. It was around this time that I first began to experience symptoms of psychosis. My first experience of psychosis occurred when I was in the dorm showers, when I heard a voice very clearly say, "I hate you." I knew that I was alone in the bathroom, and yet the voice was speaking directly into my ear. And this is why I say that hallucinations kidnap the senses, because they are so very real, just as though something were actually happening. I wondered if it was coming out of the drain through the pipe somehow, but when I realized that wasn't possible, I finished my shower and went back to my room in a daze. I told my roommate what had just happened, and she said, "You're crazy," which was not what I'd wanted or needed to hear just then. She's since apologized for her response, but it was really hard to feel alone with that experience. The hallucinations started to come more frequently. I started to see corpses in the passenger seat of cars and demonic shadows flying at my head, which would cause me to duck and dodge very dramatically. It was always the things that caused me to jump and move that freaked me out the most, because I couldn't hide that. I could look at a corpse in a car and go, "La-di-da, I don't see that." But I would jump when a hallucination of a giant hole would open up in front of me. My goal during those times was to conceal what was happening to me as much as possible, to be normal or to act normal. And meanwhile, I would go to work and interview people who would tell me stories about having manic episodes where they would, for example, climb to the top of a roof to communicate with aliens. And I kept telling myself, that's not me, but I also knew it was me. We were very much the same, except that I was getting paid to interview them, and they didn't know that I had a diagnosis. I was, in effect, living a double life. I didn't tell any of my coworkers about the psychotic symptoms that I was experiencing, because some of them would talk about our research symptoms with a certain attitude that conveyed condescension and even disrespect. I was afraid that they would think of me differently. I was afraid that they wouldn't trust me with the work that we were doing. Life would have been easier, I think, if I'd opened up back then. One of the most important things for me then and now regarding living with a serious mental illness involves my second major point, figuring out what I needed most to develop and maintain resilience, and then using self-advocacy to ask for it. Because sometimes people make assumptions about what other people need. For example, if someone is a barista, and they disclose that they're dealing with mental health symptoms, their manager might assume that they need fewer hours or that they need to be put in the back. But that might be the exact wrong thing for that person. Maybe they need more hours. Maybe they need to interact more with customers. Learning to self-advocate is essential, because we need to figure out what we need first, and then we need to figure out how to claim what we need and make that happen. I mentioned earlier the importance of language. One of the first things I learned as a mental health advocate was to use person-first language. So person with schizophrenia instead of schizophrenic, or person with depression instead of depressive. Once I became involved in the disability rights community, however, I realized that not everybody prefers this kind of speaking. Some people identify strongly with their diagnosis and don't like person-first language. In fact, person-first language really bothers some people, which is why self-advocacy is a great skill. You can tell people what kind of language you prefer. You can strengthen that self-advocacy muscle, because it's not often easy to speak up for ourselves. Self-advocacy. It's important and difficult. We are told not to trust our own minds, that we are lesser people and that our opinions don't matter. It takes a lot to battle the force of all of those insistent inner and outer critics. It takes a lot of practice to build a habit of asking for what we need. There's a saying that people associate with me. Keep going. You're doing great. I even had it put on a mug. It sounds extremely corny, I know, but it's something that means a lot to me. It means a lot to me because for so many people, being alive is no small thing. I've taken one overdose and been hospitalized as a psychiatric inpatient 3 times. If you are alive, and if you are proverbially putting one foot in front of the other, you are doing great. Resilience matters. Support systems matter, because you never know what will happen next. The writer Nicole Cliff recently asked on Twitter, "What is the most optimistic thing you believe?" Here are a few of the answers. I kind of unironically believe in the idea of tomorrow being another day. In hard times, there is usually some good on the horizon. And finally, this one. I think the best fries I'll ever eat are still in my future. All of these, even the one about the fries, are about persisting, even in hard times, which is something that even non-mental health professionals have reminded me of in my darkest hours. In 2013, I had been in a psychotic episode for 10 months, and I was about to quit my full-time job because I could no longer work. I went to see my psychiatrist, and she told me that because we had tried every atypical antipsychotic on the market, it seemed that I had a medication-resistant form of schizoaffective disorder. She said that it would be unlikely that I'd ever be at 98% or 99% or even 90% again. And I left her office sobbing, really sobbing and hopeless. There are times in life when we're terrified because the forecast for the future is really, truly bleak. If it were meteorological, it would say natural disaster. I say there are because I think these times are unavoidable. As much as we would like to think we could avoid them, these times when we wonder how we will get through and how we will make it. And as I was about to enter the doorway for the elevators full of fear and doom, the security guard stopped me. I feel like as the security guard for the psychiatric department at a big HMO, seeing a crying woman escaping for the elevators is probably not that weird. But he stopped me and he said, "Are you okay? What happened?" And I told him a short version of what had just happened. "Well," he said, and he was a very big guy, "the doctors don't know everything. Are you a writer?" I was surprised by that because how could he know that I was a writer? I said, "Yes." "Go home," he said, "and write about this." 6 years later, The Collected Schizophrenias debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. But I couldn't have imagined that on that day. All I could do was keep going, which is its own kind of resilience. I am so grateful to my psychiatrists, I am so grateful to my therapist, and I am so grateful to everyone who has helped me to survive, including the security guard, who I gave a thank you card to the next time I saw him, and then I never saw him again. So finally, I will say this. One of your biggest jobs, if you work with people who have mental health issues, is to help them keep going. If at all possible, on top of that, to keep dreaming too. And when they can't do that, for you to keep dreaming and hoping for them. I went to give a couple of talks at the Chinatown Mental Health Clinic in San Francisco a few years ago, and the first talk was fine. It was in front of a group of Chinese and Chinese American people with schizophrenia who had been meeting for years, and I felt very comfortable in front of them. These were my people, so to speak. But the second meeting was in front of clinicians, downstairs in a different room. This room was brighter and cleaner, and the clinicians started to wander in, men and women in business casual who found seats, and they stared at me, including one man who sat in the back and he actually frowned at me the entire time, and he made me nervous, but all of them, even the friendly seeming ones, made me nervous. So I tried to seem confident. I didn't want to be the crazy person giving a talk, even though I was definitely the crazy person giving a talk. I worried that they were bored. I'm pretty sure the guy in the back was actually bored. I worried so I tried to make sure to mention what schools I'd been to and what jobs I'd worked. I tried to sound professional and like I knew what I was doing. And when it was over, I was relieved. And I thought I'd just slip out of the room and go home. But this one woman stopped me before I could leave. She thanked me for coming to the clinic and for giving my talk. She said, "It's hard working with these people. At first, you have so many hopes for them, and then they get sick and relapse, and then they get better, and then they get sick again, and it happens over and over, until a lot of the time you lose that hope. Having you come today reminded me that it's important to keep having that hope for them." I've mentioned that there's a saying that people associate with me. Keep going, you're doing great. But there's another one that people probably associate with me even more than that one, and I didn't even realize it was happening until I went on book tour. As I traveled the country and even went abroad doing events, I learned that people appreciate the new book, but they also really appreciate, of all things, my good morning tweets on Twitter. By which I mean these little blessing type things that I write on a lot of mornings. It's not quite morning, but here are a few of them. Good morning. May we let ourselves soften with the pleasure of something small. May we find a granule of joy, or better yet, may we grow into our best selves and love and be loved. Eyes up, let's go. Good morning. May we be loved. May our minds thrive. May our hearts not skitter in fear, but beat proudly with courage. May we help others more than we harm. Eyes up, let's go. Good morning. May we be safe. May we not hurt others and work for justice, not only in the wider world, but in our smaller circles as well. May we love and be loved. May we be kind. Eyes up, let's go. And so those are a few examples of these tweets that grew to mean something to people. These good morning tweets that I didn't think of too much about, but that people all over the world would mention to me as being encouraging in a world that can be so desolate and frightening, especially when struggling with mental illness. I am often asked that if I could have one thing to say to a person after they receive a mental health diagnosis, what that would be. And I usually say, remember that you are still you. You are still that person who can't stand peas in their fried rice, has a freckle on their right hand, and sings like a bird. Hold on to that. And for those of you who work within systems that often reinforce the strangeness of mental illness rather than the humanity of those who live with mental illness, remember that too, and help your clients and patients to remember that. Fight the stigma that exists toward mental illness. Cultivate resilience and self-advocacy. Carry hopes and dreams. Eyes up, let's go. Thank you.
This is incredible. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Esme, for that wonderfully compelling and moving talk. I have a couple of short questions and then open it up to people in the audience.
Yeah, let's have a chat.
So you talk a little bit, actually you open up with who am I? Am I the person before I had mental illness? Am I fundamentally a mentally ill person, or am I just a person who has some aspects of that? How do you think of yourself today, and what's the most helpful thing to say to someone who's in that place?
Yeah, so this will seem like a cop-out, I think, but to me, I think the answer for myself might be one thing, but for you or you, the best answer is the one that is the most helpful for you, is the one that like helps you feel the best as you move around in your day. As I think about myself today, I think the answer that resonates with me the most is the one that I talk about when I was reading an excerpt from the book. I feel like it's kind of part of the gestalt of myself. Like it's been with me for a long time. And so it doesn't really feel so much as like something that is like overlaid on top of my real self. Yeah. But that might not be something that feels good to somebody else, you know? So I think that for somebody else, they should find whatever, you know, helps them.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
People need to find their own way.
Yeah.
So I'm part of a group that's going to study a new name for schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And it's a group from around the world that's talking about this. What do you think about the name schizophrenia? And do you have any thoughts about what might be a better name, a less stigmatizing name?
Well, I mean, given its origins, it's really outdated.
Yeah, really.
Like from schizo and phrene, like it's just, it's not relevant anymore. I think we just kind of keep it because of its origins. I don't have a better suggestion off the top of my head. I think it's a lot of pressure to try to come up with one right now.
Sorry.
No, it's
that
fine.
really put you on the spot there. I'm sorry.
Bobbity-boo. No. But I'm very glad that you're coming up with one. Okay, now I have a question for you. What is the process of coming up with a new name for something like that?
You know, we actually we wrote out a list of names, 10 or 15 names, and we're doing surveys, and we're surveying consumers and family members and mental health professionals. And I think one interesting question is, what if there's deep disagreement and the consumers say, I want this, and the mental health professionals say they want that? Being a consumer, I think consumers should get the last say, but that's kind of an interesting question as well.
How did you come up with the 10 to 15 names? Like, do you go back into Latin? Like, are you kind of...
A little bit,
yeah.
Yeah. I kind of like a combination. We have Alzheimer's dementia, something like Bleuler or Kreplin's thought disorder or something like that. But it's kind of an interesting...
I love that that's happening, though.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
And we'll have to pick your brain a lot, right? Because you're a word person. So you've talked some, but just to put it all together in one place, what are the main benefits and challenges of having this illness?
I think the main challenges are when, you know, things are really flaring up and the symptoms are at their most acute and I can't function. And I think even more than that, it's not even necessarily when the symptoms are at their most acute. It's when I'm suffering the most. Yeah. And it's, I can't remember, is schizophrenia, are schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder those disorders that where suffering is part of the criteria?
Well, as you know, with depression, that is one.
Yes.
Typically, but for schizophrenia, there's supposed to be a decline in functioning.
Okay.
It should either be, you know, difficulty working and difficulty having relationships and stuff like that. So.
But suffering is not necessarily one of the criteria.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay.
I mean, I will say you have to have symptoms that most people would suffer around.
Yes. So I guess my answer would be, it's really the suffering. So like when I was experiencing catarrh's delusion, which I write about in the book.
Tell them what that is.
Okay, so it's a rare delusion where a person believes they're dead. And so I experienced this delusion, and I write about it in the book in an essay called Perdition Days. And there were times when I was experiencing it where it wasn't
I wasn't quite suffering so much. Like I was still experiencing it, but it wasn't like I felt tormented by it, really. But then there were times where I really felt tormented by it, and that definitely was much, much worse, even though my life was being inhibited the whole time, yeah, so.
I mean, Esme and I have both suffered from something similar called capras, where you think that other people have been taken over by aliens. But I hadn't heard about Gotards, is that what it's called? Wow.
They're related. They're related because they affect similar areas of the brain.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Researchers think that they're related.
Cool. Let me just see other thoughts I had. So again, I'll say that again. So do you try to in life pass as normal, or now that you're open, are you sort of an open book about how you're thinking and feeling? I'm not saying that you broadcast to the whole world, today I'm feeling so and so, but that it's easier for you to say those hard things to close people.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. It's so funny that nobody has ever asked me this question in all of my Q&As, and you would think that this would be a really common question, but people actually have never asked me this. I think it depends on who the person is.
Okay.
Like, this kind of reminds me of like Brene Brown and like her talks on vulnerability and how she says, you have to be careful who you're vulnerable with, because like she really talks about vulnerability and advocates for vulnerability, but she makes sure to caution the listener or the reader or whatever to be careful with whom you're vulnerable. So I wouldn't necessarily tell just any old person if I were having a symptom,
Right.
Like it would have to be a person that I trust,
Right.
or
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. How about you?
Same, pretty much the same. Yeah.
Like there's some people were safer than others.
Exactly. So, factors that have hurt or challenged your recovery. What have been the biggest challenges?
Well, we were kind of talking about this a little bit yesterday, but I find that stress is a big challenge.
Yeah.
So, I'll have flares, or symptoms will crop up, or things will get worse when I'm stressed. And yet stress is something that like everybody experiences all the time. We're living in stressful times. This current administration is not helping that. The way the state of climate change and all these other things. We're not living in very unstressful times. We'll just say that. Not only is there that, but then there are like stressors in one's life. So if I love doing things like this, but it also entails traveling, and then so I have to get on a plane and go through security, and there's staying away from home and not being around my husband and my dog and things like that. And so there's always kind of that balance of how do I make my life not completely dull.
But not so wild.
But not so wild that I'm filling my life with stressors. Yeah.
Cool. So both of us share a distinction about being kicked out of Yale at one point. Actually, I went back, Esme went back, and she broke down again, and they said, well, you can't come back.
Yeah.
Which was very hard and painful, I'm
Yeah.
sure. And then you went off to Berkeley, is that right?
I went to Stanford, yeah.
Stanford, yeah. What do you think about students with mental health challenges? What should the rules be around when people can leave and come back and that kind of thing? And how can universities help students?
I think it's so complicated. I used to feel really angry at Yale about that whole situation. And
I would be furious.
the more time that's gone by, the more I've realized that it's a very complicated situation. And, there's so much liability that's, the university has to be concerned with. And so I really felt like, I really feel like there needs to be a group of people who are smarter and wiser than me, who need to come up with some kind of best practices, because all these schools have different policies. And, one school will do this thing, but then this other school will do this other thing. And, I also went to University of Michigan for my MFA, and they had this really lousy policy when I was there, but now it's a lot better. Yale was really lousy while I was there, and I just, right after my essay was published, in anticipation of my new book, the New Haven Register published an article in part about my essay, and they talked about in the article how there had been this study about how the Ivy Leagues are doing regarding their treatment of mentally ill students, and Yale received an F, so things apparently have not changed very much for them. And so I think, I do not know the answer, but I feel that if we get people together, at least there should be some consensus as to how, what might be best.
We need to be thinking about this and thinking about it collectively across
Yeah.
different universities and
And
colleges.
to get people from different areas of,
Yeah.
yeah.
So one last question for me. What was like the worst stigma you ever experienced, and what do you think the best way to combat stigma is?
Worst stigma. I'm not even sure what that would be. What is the worst stigma you've ever experienced?
I guess people thinking that tying me to a bed was okay because I wouldn't feel things that ordinary people would, which people told me, and it's totally false.
Huh, that is awful.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I've also been put in restraints, but I don't know if they thought I didn't feel anything.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything right now, but I'm sure,
Yeah, we all have
yeah,
something.
there's always something, and, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
But I think your book and my book have done well because almost everybody suffers with something. Their kid gets in a car accident and they lost all their money in the stock market and someone got sick, and everybody has something, and that's why books where people are challenged are, I think, in part, are interesting to people.
Yeah, people like to hear about how other people get through things.
Yeah.
And I'm currently working on something about how people who are dealing with chronic illness, not necessarily mental illness, but that could be included, are very fascinated. I've found are often fascinated with this group of books that include like Man's Search for Meaning, or No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh, or like Anne Frank's Diary. These books about suffering, because we're humans are not very good at suffering, but we often have to learn to be good at suffering. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, why don't we open it up for questions from the audience?
Okay. Yes, right here. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Do you ever hear from people that say you're not really seriously mentally ill, or that you're portraying an unrealistic version of what it is to be having schizophrenia?
In so many, maybe not in so many words, but I know that's what they mean. It's like when people who are autistic are advocating for people with autism, and then parents of autistic children write to them and say, that's not really how autistic children, like you're portraying an unrealistic way of how autistic kids can be. There are a lot of parallels, I think, but that's, I think, in part why I have a very complicated relationship with the term high functioning. There's an essay in the book called High Functioning. Yeah, well, do you have thoughts about this?
Sorry?
Do you have thoughts about this?
Not really.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Wait, where are you?
Over here.
Okay, thanks.
I'm a therapist. I work a lot with caregivers and people on the spectrum and learning disabilities and things like that. What are some of the most helpful things that people could say or do, or things that people you wish they would have done when you're in a really challenging moment and you're suffering a lot, to let you know that they're still on your team, even if you're not ready for them yet?
Yeah. So when I was doing really badly, we put together a care calendar because it was really helpful to have people with me, even if I wasn't really good at interacting with them. And so we would have people sign up for shifts to come sit with me. And I found all kinds of things were helpful. Sometimes I would want to have a conversation and just have a really banal conversation, like to talk about movies or whatever. And I think something that really helped was for my friends to treat me like they respected my wishes and that they wanted to know what I needed and wanted. So, they would come over and then say, like, how are you on a scale of 1 to 100 today? Like we would have like a scale, and then if they knew that I was like a 24, then it was probably a day that like I was not going to have a conversation, and that they would just sit with me. But if I was, the number were higher, maybe we would chat about something, or yeah. I think so much of it is just knowing that people are there, or that they're willing to be there, and that they don't disappear all of a sudden. I remember during that time when I was psychotic for almost a year, I received flowers from people. I asked for the flowers, but I really found that moving, because when you're sick in other ways, you often get flowers, but not when you're mentally ill. And there was this span of time when I just got flowers all the time, and it was really nice. And they would have little encouraging messages that came with them, yeah. And my sister-in-law, without asking, prepared all these frozen meals. Like just things that you would do for somebody if they were sick in other ways. Like we just had like a freezer full of frozen meals that I could heat and eat. Which you would do if someone like had just had a baby or something, but you wouldn't necessarily think to do for someone who's having a long psychotic episode. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I often start off my talk by saying that my friend came to visit me after I was diagnosed with cancer and looked past our embrace and said, "Oh, those are beautiful flowers." And I thought to myself, you get flowers when you go in for a physical illness, but not a mental illness. But your experience was that they even stepped up during the mental illness.
I asked for the flowers.
Okay.
Good
point. Good point.
But once I pointed out, like, can I please receive flowers, because this is a really hard time and people don't receive flowers for mental illness. Then my friends were like, oh, okay. And then I got lots of flowers. Yeah.
Right. Other questions? Yeah.
Ellen asked you about, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, I'm sorry. Ellen asked, I don't exactly remember the phrasing, but like the best and the worst thing about your diagnosis, and you talked about suffering. But as the mother, you didn't get to the other side, and as the mother of a son with schizophrenia, I'm longing to hear the best.
Okay. I think the best is, I think I just, there's a book called The Two Kinds of Decay by Sarah Manguso, And in it, she talks about this, I think it's a blood disease that she has, and she had when she was younger. And she says, when you have an illness, a very serious illness, you either become a huge asshole or you become more compassionate. And I like to think that I became a more compassionate person when I became ill. Because I started to think more about other people, and I think it's kind of an outgrowth of the whole suffering conversation, because you're thinking about your own suffering, it's true, but you're also very aware of the fact that you're not the only one who's suffering, that there's this whole lineage of suffering in the world, and that you're connected to all these other humans out there who are also dealing with things. And it might not be mental illness, but it might be like they've just lost their job, or like they've just lost their daughter, or, you know, whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I was curious, what's the role for like volunteers or the general public? So like I take the train in from Santa Monica a lot, and like one time there was this guy who was just like screaming for about 20 minutes, you know, and so I basically took a picture of him and tried to email like the security, and they're like, oh, you have to call in, there's nothing we can do. They wouldn't do anything. I found it really frustrating. But so I'm just curious, so like, should I have done anything, and what should people do when they like come across that?
Yeah, I think in terms of like, things are different depending on where you are. Like, I did some trainings with Starbucks about mental health issues, and they have a different policy if someone's like yelling in their Starbucks, but it is different if you're like on a train. So, there should be some kind of resource. Like I would maybe, especially if you take the train, since you take the train regularly, and probably that's not going to be the last person you see on the train who is having problems, you might just call the metro or whatever you're riding, and find some kind of line. I don't know if it would be security or something, and I just ask them, like, what should you do in that kind of situation? Or like, are there resources, or like what, or find some other resource. I don't know what a good resource would be.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can't be the only person who's dealing with that.
I have a friend who is a psychiatrist at one of the county mental health clinics on the west side who decided to leave the clinic, and she has a half-time private practice, and the other half she approaches people at Santa Monica Beach who look homeless in need of food and clothing and medicine, and tries to engage them in treatment and in the process. As a layperson, though, when you just see something like that looks upsetting and scary, you know, it's difficult to know what to do.
Yeah, it's tough because, you know, often it'll just end up getting the police involved,
Right.
and then that can be really difficult, or negative. You might result in negative consequences. So unfortunately, I'm not an expert in that matter. I apologize.
Nor am I.
Here?
Where?
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, it's okay.
I have a question. I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to say we, and place myself with you. Because one of the things that you talk about, and I like you, I don't love the term highly functioning, but when we are highly functioning and living in the world, it's a very conscious choice to reveal our illness. It's a very conscious choice because we live in a world of the mind where we have expectations of us, and there's no way that anyone looking at you thinks that you're a person who has been placed in restraints or hospitalized multiple times and never visited. So my question is, you have something beautiful on your website where you talk about creativity, resilience, and legacy. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about legacy, because if we are going to say that we put ourselves out there, we're also placing a burden and a stress on ourselves of what is the expectation once we do put ourselves out there. And how does that feel to you as a writer and Ellen as a professional that people look to and have expectations? But I think the deeper burden is the self-expectation once we place ourselves out there of what can we do, what is our legacy?
I actually, the last time I was hospitalized, which was a long time ago, 82, 83, I was on the phone from the hospital ward with my dad, and I was saying how, this is just such a terrible thing that's happened and a big burden, and I'm never going to have a life. And he's like, Ellen, people get terminal cancer and beat it, do well and beat it. This is a piece of cake. My first reaction was, he just does not understand how awful this is, how bad this is. But my second reaction was, well, maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. Maybe I shouldn't give up. Maybe I should go forward, notwithstanding the doctors were telling me to be a cashier for several years and that kind of thing. But,
Yeah, I like that story. I think that so I talk about legacy a lot because it's something that I have thought about since I've gotten sick. Because I also deal with chronic illness. Chronic illness is more physical, and that's also in the book. That's been called a number of different things. So mortality is something that is on my mind a lot. And so when I think about legacy, legacy can be this very big thing that can put a lot of pressure on you or me. But I think instead of, I think that if you feel like the word legacy makes you feel more expansive, it makes you feel like going out there and doing big things and dreaming big dreams and starting institutes and things like that, go for it. But sometimes I think a better word or a word that can be more helpful is impact, because impact is something that you can have every day. Impact can be the cashier you're nice to when you're buying your coffee in the morning, or impact can be the security guard who was kind to me that day in my psychiatrist's office. I mean, that was a quote-unquote small thing, but it was actually the biggest thing ever. And I've never forgotten him, and I probably will never forget him, even though I don't even know his name. So yeah, I think sometimes the word impact can be more helpful to think about, if that helps. Wait. Oh, okay. I wanted to wait. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to thank you both for sharing your powerful stories and for helping fight the mental illness stigma. I've struggled with post-concussion syndrome accompanied by depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and a recovery-oriented approach really turned things around and helped me function. I love that you both are very autonomous and are sharing your stories. When you were speaking about changing names for schizophrenia, it just sparked the thought of maybe even reconsidering all the names that we have, and even just for regarding it as a mental illness or as a disorder, having that negative attachment to these conditions. Just thinking maybe we can, I don't know how you both would feel, but look at it as more positive regard. Speaking of suffering and speaking about society conditioning us to not feel and not be able to share how you think and everything like that, then embracing those and having these feelings of extreme sadness or having these creative thoughts and visions, hallucinations, whatever you want to call it, maybe looking at it as a more positive regard and as gifts and talents so people can accept and be able to cope with it better.
I don't really have anything.
I mean, the way I feel is I feel like I have a biochemical condition that requires medication and intensive therapy. But I say that not because I've done heavy philosophical lifting around how do you distinguish mental illness from eccentricity or difference, but because it makes my life better to think that. And if for someone else, if it feels better to think it's neurodiversity and they're totally fine and or even better than most people are, and that works for you, I think that's great. So it's not one size fits all. And I don't really think of this illness as giving me gifts, really. But.
Yeah, like I would agree. Although in the last couple of chapters of the collected schizophrenias, I do kind of explore that a tiny bit. The last, I think it's the last chapter. It's called Beyond the Hedge, is about like my exploration of what if schizoaffective disorder is some form of spiritual gift, and kind of my exploration in that direction. Yeah, I think it really, it's kind of, I do agree so much with what you just said. It reminds me of my whole thing about like, you know, if person first language is something that you feel good about, go for it. If you would prefer not to use person first language, then go for that. If you prefer to feel like your diagnosis is the gestalt of yourself, like, and that makes you feel better, you know, or the opposite, you know.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Just really quick, sorry. Speaking of the gestalt, I was just referring to the quote unquote gifts, more like writing or speaking in front of a group of people or acting exercises, to be able to not have those thoughts trapped inside, but to be able to release whatever you're feeling or thinking and be applauded for this creative side of you rather than shamed. But I think you spoke to that in regards to like embracing that part of you.
This person in the orange.
Is that what you're talking about? Is that the person you mean?
Oh, thank you for the attention. I was actually going to bring up your last chapter, the Beyond the Hedge chapter, because I think it was very intentionally put at the end, I'm assuming, with this journey, and ending up in a place that gave you comfort in a way that you hadn't found before. And I worked with a lot of young people who were experiencing their first experiences with extreme states, and I'm wondering what kind of traumatic experiences that they've had in institutions, in hospitals, that could be prevented with even that option. You both talk about choice and whatever works best, but I think choice is also a privilege. And for our young people who, you know, have been institutionalized from young ages, from birth really, how is it that we can infuse that idea of choice in systems early on, and especially that of the spiritual nature? I think with mindfulness, we've taken that and really seen its power, and with maybe depression, anxiety disorders, but for severe mental illness, we haven't really taken that into the mainstream. But I wonder about the traumatic experiences that could be prevented when people are first experiencing these extreme states.
When you talk about institutions, do you mean like foster care or group homes, or what kind of institutions?
So, yeah, foster care is group homes, but then their first experiences with the mental health system of being hospitalized even in adolescence or as young adults. I'm wondering, when you were first, what kind of things could have been helpful for you in those first hospitalizations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I continue to think that my hospitalizations are like some of the most traumatic experiences of my life. And so much of it is, as you said, that you just lack so much autonomy, and that it's so frightening to not only lack control over your mind, but also to not be able to go outside when you want to, or go to sleep when you want to, or and things like that. I'm not sure. I'm sorry to say that I probably don't have a very good answer for you, and I'm sorry. But my first thought would be, I really wish that psychiatric institutions could be redesigned. And I think this would be the case for adults and for young people. I wouldn't be so terrified of being rehospitalized all the time if I knew that the place that I was going to wasn't going to traumatize me so badly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I basically found my psychiatric hospitalization incredibly traumatic. I really did. A study that we're doing is sort of relevant to this. So typically we find people who are ill, incompetent, and appointing a guardian to make their decisions, taking choice away. But we're studying something called supported decision making, where we ask people to pick a couple of people in their lives whom they trust and have those people help you make a decision, even though it's your final decision. And we're studying sort of who they pick and why, and satisfaction with the decision-making process, and then downstream effects like more independent living and independent working. And we have 4 jurisdictions for that study: USC, UCLA, UCSD, and downstate SUNY in New York. And then a second study is confined to California, but we're going to 10 or 12 counties in California and looking at both supported decision-making protocols and psychiatric advance directives, which is a really cool way to give people back agency over their lives. If you say, if this should happen to me, this is what I want to happen. So having some control and some ability to control, I think, is really, really important. But in terms of hospitals, no.
Christopher, how are we doing here?
We got 3 minutes, so it's 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay.
Hi, this is for Professor Sachs. You said you haven't been hospitalized since like '82. Can you tell me what you did to keep yourself out of the hospital?
Yeah, I actually have a huge amount of resources to help me, right? So I think there are 3 things that kept me being well, and one was excellent treatment. So both meds, once I recognized I needed them, and I go to 4 or 5 day a week psychotherapy for decades. Second, relationships, they give my life a meaning and a depth, but they also serve as another set of eyes if I start slipping. And then a workplace that's both incredibly stimulating and also very accommodating. So all those things, going together are sort of what helped me kind of evade my grave prognosis and end up, having a really good and happy life. I'm very lucky. I've also had a bunch of cancer. One of my friends who's a neurologist says, Ellen, for an unlucky person, you're very lucky. So.
One more question. Are you guys bringing any awareness to the criminal justice system? Because as we know, so many people with mental health are being incarcerated. And that's a really sad reality, and it's very concerning to me.
Yeah, well, our SDM and PAD project throughout California, one of the outcomes is less criminal involvement. So that's one of the things we're studying. But it's a really good point. I mean, people with mental health challenges don't belong in jail. They really don't. Yeah.
other than medications that psychiatrists have prescribed you, have you ever taken any holistic treatment or CBD or ever gone to like a shaman?
I've tried CBD, but it didn't seem to do anything for me. And I've never been to a shaman.
Yeah, I've just been very conventional, mainstream kind of medicine. I have not done that. But that's it. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.